Daniel. It's been a wonderful institution to visit and work with. Certainly I want to thank the three organizers, including Lorraine York and Rachel, as well as Daniel, for inviting me to this event. And it's wonderful to see all those who've been hailing from far away. So I'm also going to say that I'm very sorry I'm not going to be able to be here on Sunday. I have a Monday morning meeting in the US and I have to fly there on Sunday late morning. So I'm very sorry I'm going to miss the big battle, but I hope you will let me know what happens. So the title of my paper is, and my apologies, especially to the German-speaking people in the room, Es gibt eine kanadische Literatur, that's quote, Relatedness in Canadian Literary Studies as Foreign Policy. There is such a thing as Canadian literature, that's the English translation of my German title. There is such a thing as Canadian literature, wrote the late German scholar Walter Packer in 1976. He made this announcement in the context of his review of two anthologies of short stories by Canadian authors, translated into German, and published one in West Germany and the other in East Germany. Louis von Flotow from the University of Ottawa, in a chapter titled Narrating Canada's Story in German, included in Translating Canada that she co-edited with Radbert Nischig, identifies the statement as a historic moment. Even though von Flotow discusses translation as the primary vehicle of export for Canadian literature, a vital factor that mobilizes literary works, especially those that tell mainstream stories, unquote, it is not the act of translating Canadian literature that she casts in this lauded position. Her emphasis falls unequivocally on Packer's review. To state the obvious, reviews play a seminal role in this process, as they have the potential to influence as much the national as the global cultural marketplace, especially when they appear in newspapers or other publications that have a wide circulation, as did Packer's review. They can make or break a writer's career, catapult a book to the bestseller list or to oblivion, and can open the way to foreign rights and thus translation. But while an author can never forget a bad or good review, reviews rarely, if at all, become a part of the critical canon. Though von Flotow does not tell us anything specific about Packer's review, she nevertheless identifies his publication as a landmark event. In yet another chapter by von Flotow in the same book, this one authored with Frida Uerding, Packer's review is again praised, this time as groundbreaking. This is puzzling, not only because this review is rather short, but also because of the ways in which von Flotow and Uerding discuss extensively and poignantly the role of reviews in general. A review, they write, narcissistically relates the incoming materials to literary and other conditions at home. It is also a genre, they state, that works with stereotypes, easing readers into foreign materials by drawing parallels between existing cliches about the export country and the content of the work, unquote. Finally, they point out that, quote, reviews are seldom original pieces of work. They are derivative and repetitive, often based on the press package that the publisher provides, unquote. But if this is the case, and I believe their analysis of reviews is spot on, then what qualifies Packer's review as an exception to the rule? The most we learn about his review is that neither anthology reviewed represented the full spectrum of Canada and Canadian literature. If Packer's review of two by now outdated anthologies, one of them edited by a German-Canadian, still warrants mention of it 30 years later, it is not because it offers any extraordinary insights about CanLit, but rather because it is seen as an inaugural act that has clearly played a performative role for four reasons. First, his declarative statement proclaims CanLit as a national literature outside of Canada, thus bringing this literature to the attention of German readers and, as a consequence, helping to expand the circulation horizon for Canadian literary titles. Second, His title might affirm the emergence of a cohesive literary tradition, but Parker draws attention to the difference between Franco and Anglo-Canadian literatures and their respective colonial lineages, attributing the paucity of the freestanding Canadian identity as much to this history as to the domineering influence of the United States. 3, he creates the ground for German, as well as other German-speaking scholars to pursue a new field of study. And 4th, he announces the existence of CanLit at a time when, as von Frotto says, this may still have been used even to Canadians. So Parker's review did not just bring news to Germans. It was also a heralding moment for Canadians who apparently were still oblivious in 1976 to the fact that they had national literature. This suggests that the generative and historical value attributed to this review derives from the fact that it has contributed, we are led to believe, to the formation of CanLit as a field outside of Canada, while serving, at the very least, as a wake-up call to Canadians. We thus learned in 2009, via German scholarship on Canadian literature, that it took a foreigner to let us Canadians know that we did have our own literature in the mid-70s, after all, and we will. No wonder then Parker's review is a landmark text, since it relieved Canadians from the state of ignorance. If I have focused so much on some old news in more ways than one, it is because I take the exceptional status ascribed to Parker's review to be paradigmatic of some of the important issues typifying the export of CanLit and its study by foreign scholars. The exemplarity of this mini-case study is apparent in the different layers of relatedness inscribed in Parker's announcement of the birth of or discovery of Canadian literature as a national literature worthy of critical attention by non-Canadians. The terms in which this review is granted such a canonical standing reveal the general relatedness that characterizes literatures in relation to European culture. A sign of Eurocentrism, this kind of relatedness belongs to the genealogy of imperial and colonial politics. A literature exists only so far as it is recognized within a Eurocentric context. In this regard, what renders Canada as a sign warranting critical attention outside of Canada is that it is part of the West, but also, to evoke an old paradigm, a new country that is the byproduct of the old world. As a new Western literature, CanLit is virtually an oxymoron. Its double identity or positioning grants it, I would argue, special academic appeal to non-Canadians. As both Eurocentric and a new other, it is virtually configured as a virginal field, thus inviting scholars to venture into what is assumed to be a previously uncharted territory. As Reinhard Nietzsche noted in 1985, the same book that he referred to gaining ground and subverted into the public approach, quote, "The academic reception of Canadian literature in Germany developed within the wider framework of a cautious opening up to a world common with literatures," unquote. These conditions allow Canadian literature to gain immediate, more or less, validation by virtue of its kinship or similarities, be they real or imaginary, with, say, British literature, while at the same time postulating itself as a secularist tradition characterized by its agonistic relations with its colonial origins and the anxiety attendant to its post-colonial development. At a different level, if we agree that by the mid-70s there had already been a concerted attempt in Canada to institutionalize CanLit, then it is Parker's own discovery that is belated. Still, the trope of belatedness in this review and how it is read today echoes, I think, the same syndrome of belatedness that has been a recurrent mark in discussions about the formation of Canadian literature and Canadian studies in Canada. Perhaps then, it would be more accurate to say that it was not the Canadians' obliviousness to the existence of the literature that Parker discovered, as von Flotto seems to suggest, but rather CanLit's own ambivalence about itself as a new Western literature, certainly not the same thing. This ambivalence speaks as much to an anxiety of not measuring up to its European origins as to an anxiety of influence. For when we read CanLit's European pedigree colonial terms, it manifests itself as a hegemonic or menacing presence. Menacing since it threatens to render it at best inconsequential, at worst visible. To wit, where is here? Hence the centrifugal and centripetal trajectories that the formation and recalibration of CanLit as an institution have followed, and the persistent desire, at least in my view, to sublimate this double anxiety. To appropriate Harold Bloom writing about American literature's own belatedness, CanLit is consciously late. There is surely a difference between being consciously late and being oblivious to one's lateness. A distinction that, I would venture to say, often goes unnoticed in criticism of Canadian literature outside of Canada. And let's remind ourselves that to be a latecomer is not necessarily a bad thing. It is, after all, immigrants, latecomers in relation to settlers, who have reconstituted to a great extent our understanding of Canada and CanLit. That Canadian literature has subsequently reconfigured itself as a multicultural literature adds an interesting twist to its condition of relatedness. No matter the problems of Canadian multiculturalism, it engages with so-called others in ways that suspend in this context Canada's general relatedness and transfer it instead to other states where the reception and treatment of immigrants is lagging behind. The ambivalent and anxious state of CanLit, the desire and need to be recognized by others as a distinct other, undergirds the various attempts by the Canadian state to support Canadian culture within Canada and to promote it beyond its borders via different means of export. This was made abundantly clear in the 1951 Massey Report, which stated that, quote, if modern nations were marshaled in the order of the importance which they assign to national culture, Canada would be found far from the vanguard. She would even be near the end of the procession, unquote. 4 years later, 4 years after the Massey Report was released, Thomas H.G. Simons, skipping some stuff, so I had to find it in the next sentence. Yeah, he released his own report, a 3-volume publication that has been equally influential. And as Serge Jomet notes, in the Canadianists, the ICCS 25 years in the service of Canadian studies, the Simons Report represents a watershed in the development of Canadian studies, inside and outside of Canada. This doesn't mean that there weren't already Canadian studies centers overseas prior to the release of Simons' report. In fact, the Simons report identified 50 such centers. 1969 saw the founding of the Center of Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University. 1970, the formation of the Center for Canadian Studies in France. And 1971, this time in Virginia, the formation of the Association for Canadian Studies in the US. To close my brief foray into this part of Canadian cultural policy history, in typical Canadian fashion, that is belated fashion, the Association of Canadian Studies was established in 1973 during the Learned Societies meeting at Queen's University. What public policy entails is the urgency to developing contacts and resources as a means of helping Canadians to understand themselves and of enabling citizens of other countries having close ties with Canada to arrive at a better understanding of Canada, the nation, and of some of its contributions to the world community, unquote. That's a quote from Serge Jomet. Noble sentiments that graph an interesting triangulated movement. Cultural products, in our case here literature, are created and manufactured in Canada through largely what the cultural industries call welfare-style grants, because the grants serve to keep the publishers in business from year to year, but do nothing to make Canadian publishers more competitive against foreign firms. Products that are exported to countries via ways and investments that are commensurate to other countries' political and economic relevance to Canada. And a study of these products abroad often undertaken until recently with the support of yet further Canadian investment that produces, in return, this sought-after thing called Understanding Canada. Understanding Canada as a policy, then, functions as a national episteme that calibrates in decisive ways the relationality between Canadian cultural production and foreign relations. How does this episteme figure in the criticism of CanLit or Canada as an object of study produced by our foreign counterparts? To what extent European and Asian literary critics become, and witness or perhaps, the instruments of this national episteme that has traditionally promoted a homogeneous and mainstream view of Canada? How and where does this understanding of Canada circulate as a body of knowledge, knowledge produced outside Canadian borders, but under the auspices of Canadian diplomacy that includes substance? Is it exported back to Canada in a gesture of reciprocity and perhaps in the hope that will release Canadians from their perennial ambivalence? Or is it intended to stay where it is produced, to be instrumentalized by the scholars for professional and other reasons? Big questions, and not easy questions to ask. Suffice it to say, in this context, cultural policy is not exactly synonymous with foreign policy. While it is the Department of Foreign Affairs that has traditionally handled the export of Canadian studies, the cultural agenda in diplomacy operates as a trope. It is a tool employed for the advancement of goals that are at best only peripherally related to culture in general and to literature in particular. More specific, and that is shown in the figures that Crystal shared with us, which I think is fascinating. More specifically, it is an instrument that emerged from the recognition that knowledge economies could play a major role as much in producing knowledge about others as about contributing to economic development at large. It is important to note that the Canadian concerted efforts towards developing a cohesive cultural policy that was both reactive and proactive took place in the middle of the Cold War era. Interestingly enough, while the United States at that time was aggressively establishing its state policy by means of the intelligence university nexus, namely area studies in American universities designed to fill the vacuum of knowledge about others via massive information retrieval that constituted the study of non-Western cultures, Canada was developing a reverse policy, whereby its sponsoring and funding of various studies shed itself as a subject. The time lag between the Canadian model of cultural policy and the American model of area studies exposes the underdeveloped nature of Canadian cultural capital in relation to the global sphere in the first as well as subsequent configurations of endeavors of what we have come to call today Understanding Canada. To push this a little further, the United States proceeded from the status of hegemonic self-confidence, while Canada acted from a locus of self-awareness about its paradoxical position. Paradoxical because Canada emerged from the Second World War as a major international player, but one that decidedly lacked a strong cultural signature. If area studies about others reflects the American state's self-interest in the power and control it may garner from knowledge production, Canadian studies, as the equivalent of area studies, is similarly mobilized by self-interest. But this kind of interest is to be actualized by seeing oneself in and through the eyes of others. Thus, the establishment of Canadian studies programs abroad was about self-formation, a process of building. In this context, culture operates as a sign that marks, quote from Dowler, marks the moment when the Canadian state performs on its own behalf a transformation from preoccupation with issues of sovereignty toward a form of governmentality, unquote. In this context, then, Canadian cultural policy has exerted its regulatory power in two sides simultaneously. Within Canada, it has focused on the production of cultural citizens. At the same time, it exports its regulation of cultural economy and its production of compliant citizens who learn self-governance in the interest of cultural capital quality. That's a quote from Louis Miller. To say the obvious, this double process of promoting an understanding of Canada has a nationalist and therefore ideological agenda. As Philip Resnick wrote about the cultural industries in 1975, Canadian nationalism means good business. Brian Edwardson, in his recent study Canadian content, agrees. Those who had participated in the process of understanding Canada, he writes, quote, stood to collect economic benefits, unquote. If the fact that Harvard has blatantly failed this summer to strike a trade accord with the European Union is to be taken as a measure of understanding Canada's efficacy as policy at a larger scale, then we could surmise it is seriously circumscribed, confined exclusively to the domain of academic study and cultural exchanges. When the Harper government announced last year it was going to phase out understanding Canada, there was a general outcry against the sudden decision. Sudden, yes, but it must be said and utterly consistent with other Harper recent announcements, such as the massing of Canadian librarians, archivists, and scientists working for the federal government. Part of Harper's recent housekeeping policy, it is a decision rationalized in the name of fiscal responsibility, which of course doesn't make sense, as Crystal highlighted for us. But as John Graham, former career diplomat, put it, quote, it's just the most appalling false economy to take it away. Canadian studies works as a hybrid engine. You put in a little gas and foreign universities and governments keep the battery charged, unquote. I couldn't agree more. Nevertheless, at the same time that Harper's announcement made me irate, I must admit that I felt a growing discomfort at the noticeably uniformed and ultimately simplistic nature of the collective response. It's not that I don't believe in the value of the Canadian Studies programs or the high caliber of scholarship they have produced. Rather, it is the sacrosanct status ascribed to understanding Canada, its projected untouchability, that makes me nervous. Especially so since its success has been appraised virtually exclusively in numerical terms. The quantitative approach is limited to offer us a true appraisal of the program. Since I'm almost running out of time here, I'd like to finish by stating my views rather bluntly. And I'll do so mostly in the interrogative mode in the hope that I may generate some questions. In light of the ambivalencies and complicities characterizing cultural policy as diplomacy that I have already outlined, I think that we should not just celebrate what understanding Canada has accomplished. In trying to come up with prognosis about the future of international Canadian literature studies, what the conveners of the event have invited us to think about, I believe we should also take a critical look at the program from a variety of perspectives. So here is a sampling of possible question paths in no specific order that we may want to pursue. What is the relevance of the program introduced in the early 70s to Canada and CanLit in the second decade of the 21st century? Why do we need nation-state focused study programs at a time when the nation and the state have been radically questioned and reconfigured? What happens to Canadian literature and CanLit as institutions when they travel overseas, where they are taught in highly different pedagogical and cultural contexts? How readily available in Canada is international Canadian studies scholarship? Not enough. What kind of influence, if any, has international scholarship about Canada exercised on Canadian scholarship? With a few notable exceptions, not much, I'm afraid, and I think we should ask why this is the case. We should be honest and acknowledge that this vital turning point that understanding Canada, like other state and similar programs, has been used well by many, but also abused by many. We should ask whom it really serves and how. Engineering the formation of a new or reinvented disciplinary area, as Understanding Canada did, involves a script that is about as much the object of study as about the professional development of those advocating and practicing this engineering. Why should Canada continue to subsidize such professional and personal aspirations and development at this point in time? At the very least, Understanding Canada should get rid of its name. I, for one, don't want Canada to be understood. This kind of understanding is built on ordering, on governmentality, on regulation. I think we've had enough of that. Given the present defunding of Canadian universities and the humanities, does it make sense to continue funding the international style of Canada outside of Canada? What does it say about the Canadian national imaginary if we continue state sponsorship of international Canadian studies in an era of rampant globalization? Are we afraid that if we don't pay people, they will not study us? I mean, what kind of, psychic or other scripts are behind this idea? To conclude then, I think Kamboureli is correct when he says that, quote, traditional thinking about areas has been driven by conceptions of geographical, civilizational, and cultural coherence that rely on immobile aggregates of traits with more or less durable historical boundaries, unquote. Shouldn't we then do away with the descriptiveness of understanding Canada as a meta-narrative and, in the spirit of Kamboureli, develop research ties and networks of reciprocity between Canadian and international scholars in ways that are more appropriate to our time's mobilities? Thank you.